Good evening and welcome everybody to this General Federation of Trade Union Educational Trust series on trade union and working class history, done in partnership with the Marx Memorial Library and the Working Class Movement Library in Salford. If you've not come across my name's Dennis McGinn. I'm the Secretary and a Trustee for the Working Class Movement Library. If you haven't come across the library before, just a very brief note about us. The library was founded by two communists, Ruth and Eddie Frau, and we have 42 rooms that are full of books, archive from the movement, newspapers, publications, ceramics, badges, banners, etc., etc. And our purpose is to make the history of working class movements available to people so that they can interpret it and understand our past to allow us to have a better understanding and interpretation of a class conscious interpretation of contemporary politics and economics. This event is a Zoom webinar, which means that you can see us, but nobody can see anybody else. So feel free to use the chat throughout the call. And if you want to ask any questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Can I take this opportunity to remind us that at all times during the call, we will be following the GFTU Education Trust Behaviour Statement that you can see in the link in the chat below. This is the 7th session we've had of this year's programme, and the topic for discussion tonight will be the Ford Dagenham women's dispute, led by Professor Mary Davis. The session will be a maximum, hopefully Mary talking, but I might carry on beyond 45 minutes, but the intention is for 45 minutes, followed by an equal period of questions of Mary afterwards, coming to a finish time of about 8:30. Our speaker, as I indicated, is Mary Davis, Professor Mary Davis. She is a Labour historian. She has, from a Marxist perspective, written, broadcast and lectured widely on women's history, the Labour history, imperialism and racism. She had been awarded a TUC Gold Badge in 1910 for services to the trade union movement. She serves on the Morning Star Management Committee, the Sylvia Pankhurst Memorial Committee, and is Secretary of the Marx Memorial Library and Workers' School. And sometime spaced within all that, she's managed to put together a talk about one of the key moments in women's movement for equality and a key movement in an organisation for the working class movement. So, Mary, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I want to sort of set this in a context, really, because this is a story really about combating low pay. It's not just about equal pay, but the context, I think, is that we have to understand is that there was a very, very long fight throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, because we still haven't got equal pay, a very long fight for low pay and unequal pay in a capitalist society. And we need to think about why this is the case. What we see in this long fight, really starting actually at the end of the 18th century, and I won't go into the whole history of it, I promise you. What we see is that there's been really very little trade union support up until recently. In fact, the first resolution, or the TUC passed its first resolution on equal pay in 1888. Although I have to say a much more radical organisation called the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union actually passed a motion or adopted a demand for equal pay for work of equal value in 1834. So that was a very radical movement. And in fact, after the mid 19th century, the trade union movement, I'm afraid, was less radical. So the question is why so little was done and why it really took women organising to ensure that that item was on the agenda. And I think we have to understand the context really is that deeply held patriarchal and sexist attitudes penetrated all forms of class society, including the labour movement itself. Not only in capitalist society, but it was certainly in capitalist society. This was the worst. Women workers, women always worked. In fact, women were the first factory workers, so it wasn't a case of women not working. But what we find throughout the history of industrial capitalism is that these deeply ingrained patriarchal and sexist attitudes resulted even in the trade union movement, colluding with the dominant notion that there was job segregation, that women, yes, they worked, but they worked in the areas which were offshoots of their domestic production, and therefore that work was undervalued. And so that's what we call job segregation. But it was also imbued with this notion, and it really affected wages, that there was such a thing as the family wage, and it was paid to the male breadwinner. So in other words, women's low pay and unequal pay is an absolute feature of class society throughout, and it still is, and it still has to be challenged because it still exists. And of course, it's a major, and capitalism doesn't want to end it because it's a major source of super profit. So women are super exploited, and that is because of women's oppression. But the super exploitation is a very, very profitable one for capitalism itself. And as you know, the source of all labour is the source of all value, and labour power, I should say, and through labour power it creates surplus value. But I won't go into a Marxist analysis of surplus value right now. So that's the context in which we need to understand the fact that we still haven't made much progress, but we are going to look at the women starting to fight back, and that's what's made a difference. But I don't want anybody to run away with the idea that somehow we've cracked this, because we haven't. Women's pay is still substantially less. We talk about the sex pay gap, and it still is. It's still there. So, without going through the major history of the fight for equal pay, which I say actually in a way was very limited indeed throughout the 19th century, apart from that very radical revolutionary period up until 1850. I mentioned, the Grand National the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union was the union that the Tolpuddle Martyrs belonged to, by the way, and they had a fantastic newspaper called The Pioneer, which had a page. Originally, it was called A Page for the Ladies, but the women really didn't like that, and it then was called the Women's Page. So. But I would say that from 1850 onwards, very little done, even though that motion was passed in 1888 by the TUC, nothing much was done. So I want to look at the situation really rather from the Second World War onwards, which really coincides with the period that we're going to be talking about. Both world wars, of course, saw a massive entry of women into men's jobs. In other words, job segregation suddenly ceased to exist as men were called to the front in both world wars, and that they operated they were engineers, they were all of these things that women weren't supposed to do, but they did it, armaments industry and so on. In the Second World War, massive entry into women were in fact conscripted to go into those jobs. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is how it relates to what I'm going to talk about, is that as a result of women's conscription and not only into the land army, but I mean into the world, into the men's jobs, the government, and it was a coalition government during the war, the Second World War, the government recognised that actually this was posed a bit of a problem, because the issue really which it determined the fact that women always were low paid and underpaid and in segregated jobs was the contradiction between women's role in the domestic sphere of reproduction, if you like, of the family, the labour force, and so on, and women's role in social production. In other words, how do you manage work and home? And the government in during the Second World War recognised that this was a problem for women, and as a result, an amazing thing happened during the Second World War. The state intervened in this and opened a massive number of day nurseries for women who were working very long hours, and even recognised that cooking and cleaning couldn't be done so easily, and they opened British restaurants where women and children could get a decent meal because women didn't have time to go home and cook. So all of these things, however, in other words, when it was needed, it was done. But there were always those who said, this is not such a good idea because this then disrupts the family. And somehow or other, this means that it disrupts the notion that women's place really is in the home and they work only for pin money. So in the aftermath in 1945, Labour government was there. And a really equally amazing but shocking thing happened, and that was that the Labour government decided that this was all wrong, that we had to, go back to the traditional women's traditional role and traditional role of the family, and they closed all the day nurseries, everything, all those social provisions which made life a bit easier for working women. And the TUC absolutely backed that. At the 1949 TUC Congress, a motion was passed, and this sums it up. It said, in the light of the continuing need for counter-inflationary policies, the committee decided, that's the General Council, that a further approach by the TUC to the government on equal pay would be inappropriate at the present time. So in other words, forget equal pay. Women go back into the home and still have to balance this whole contradiction that women have faced throughout history of their role as within the home and their role in social production. So in the 1950s, the gap between women's and men's earnings was on average 50%. I mean, it's massive. And by the way, even when they went into the men's jobs during the war, they still didn't get the same rate of pay as the men did. What they got was what was called dilution, which meant low pay. So there was a certain amount of progress in the 1950s on equal pay, but only really in the public sector. White-collar unions in the 1950s in the public sector, under pressure from women members, because a massive amount of women worked as clerks. I mean, clerical work became the dominant, one of the dominant areas of employment for women, but there was an intensive campaign which resulted in 1955 in the government announcement that they would attempt to equalise pay in the public sector. They would attempt to do it, and that but only for men and women doing equal work. Well, actually, that didn't usually happen, but nevertheless, there was an attempt to do but they said that they would introduce it gradually over 7 years, and that actually didn't really happen much. But apart from some professional women and some local government workers and women civil servants, the 1950s was a very big period for women anyway. In fact, the whole social security system was based on the notion that somehow or other the family wage still existed and women really didn't need to work. And some unmarried women certainly didn't need to work. And of course, that's complete myth and well, a lie. So, 1950s, what I'm basically saying, that any advance that was made as a result of the war years was completely eroded. And what tended to happen was that in order to fit in the women's two roles, what you saw in the 1950s was the massive increase in part-time work for women as a great concession somehow. And part-time work's even lower paid, so that they could fit in their two roles, their feminine role, which was there to look after men and the children. And their work. But anyway, so a little bit of progress in the public sector, very little in the private sector. But in the 1960s, things did change a bit, largely because of the growth of a women's movement in the 60s and 70s. But also, interestingly enough, the Labour Party manifesto for the 1964 general election called for a charter of rights for all employees to include the right to equal pay for equal work, which that sounded pretty good. But this was only done, actually, I sound very cynical here, but I would say that was there because it was prompted by the Labour Party's desire to join the European Economic Community, in other words, the Common Market, the EC as it was called then, so that it would be in compliance with the Treaty of Rome's clause requiring member states to adopt the principle of equal pay, not equal pay, but the principle. But anyway, the application was turned down and the Wilson government absolutely shelved the issue, but it didn't go away. But it did lead to another kind of resolution that the TUC, kind of following the Labour Party, also said that it reaffirmed its support for the principles of equality of treatment and opportunity for women workers in industries, and calls upon the General Council to request the government to implement the promise of the right to equal pay for equal work. That's about as far as it went, and really it might have just stayed just there, i.e. good intentions, principles. Yes, we want this, like, we're against, I don't know, we're for equality, but we don't do anything about it. And I think really the whole thing would have been forgotten for another decade or two were it not for the action of women trade unionists, and this time in the private sector. Now, that was important, and this is why the Ford dispute is important, because it was the first time that, well, actually maybe not the first time, but the first time for a long time that the private sector really, the demand was really raised then. In fact, until the Ford strike of 1968, the campaign for equal pay was centred almost exclusively, as I've mentioned, in the public sector. So what happened in 1968? Well, generally speaking, the Ford strike of 1968 is called an equal pay strike, and it wasn't. But it did open the door to that. In 1968, you probably know the bare bones of the outline of the story, but I'll repeat it anyway. Women sewing machinists, they sewed the covers for the car seats. But so in the two factories in Dagenham and in Halewoods, they went on strike over a regrading demand. It wasn't over equal pay; it was a regrading demand. And in the course of the regrading exercise, management informed the women who made the seat covers that their jobs were going to be regraded in what was called category B. That was category B was the less skilled production jobs instead of category C, which are the more skilled production jobs. And of course, the women recognised that actually sewing is a skill. I mean, machining is a skill. I'll come back to that thing about skill in a moment, because skill is, who defines what skill is? You know,
Mm.
who's to say that a shorthand typist, as they were then, is not a skilled worker? And yet, the same kind of job, or the typing job, was done by male compositors on in the print in those days. I'm talking about, not anymore, and that was one of the most highly paid jobs. Well, you know, so there's an ideological and aspect to who defines skill. But at any rate, so the Ford bosses decided that really this was a less skilled job, and therefore they would be paid less, paid 15% less than the full B rate received by men. So, in other words, it was a regrading thing, and there was the skills of the men were regarded, or the semi skills of the men, or skills, men were skilled, women were less skilled, and they got 15% less than the rate for the similar rate that the men got. So, this was not the case of women doing the same work as men. That's the real issue, because men and women rarely did the same work. But their argument was that what the work that they were doing, and this was the innovative thing that they said, that their work was equal in value to that of the male rate. It wasn't the same, but it was equal in value. And that was really that was almost going back to the 1934 demand of the very radical trade unionists who did talk about equal value. They knew that men and women weren't doing the same work. This becomes very important later, as we shall see. So their argument was that their work required equal skill, and one of the shop stewards of the women machinists, a woman called Maureen Jackson, put it very, very well. I'm going to quote her in full. She said, if our work built up and they didn't need so many car seats, they would say to some of the girls, oh, we'd like you to go over to the door panels because they're a bit short staffed. And the girls would go over there and get stuck in and do the door panels, or in the tank shop, they would find you work over there. But when we were very busy and there was quite a few spare machines, they could never say to the men, would you come over and do a bit of machining? Because, you know, the men would never have a clue even to thread a needle. I should think, rather than do machining, in the end, the women started talking amongst themselves and saying, well, this isn't on. We can sort of turn our hands to anything, but the men can't. Well, I think that says it beautifully, really. So basically, as a result of this so-called offer by the Ford management, what started as an overtime ban, uh, albeit an unofficial one, led to a strike by 187 women at the Dagenham plant, and that quickly escalated into an all-out stoppage in Halewood and in Dagenham. And this was precipitated by Ford management sending a threatening letter to the women, warning them that they'd breached their contract. So, as I say, the Dagenham strike was joined by the Halewood strike, and the strike lasted 3 weeks. Now, this strike was not actually supported by the women's own union, which at that time was the National Union of Vehicle Builders. However, there was one, he happened to be a communist convener, a man called Bernie Passingham for the Transport and General Workers Union. He supported the women's claim. So it wasn't an official strike, they did it, but Bernie Passingham was, pretty far-sighted. Well, he had politics. That's the real issue. He supported the women's claim, and he supported the strike from its inception. Um, the, the and he said that and I think I'm quoting him here. Yes, I am quoting him. He said the women got totally ignored, and that some of our national officials, they didn't agree with what we were doing. They didn't think it was right. And so we, particularly myself, have to push them aside. And he was referring then to his own union, the T&G, which was also slow to make the strike official, or at least support it. Anyway, the fact of the matter was that the strike brought all production at Ford to a standstill. And this was a major blow to Ford owners. I feel very sorry for them, who were losing about, I think it's estimated that they lost about £1.25 million each day of the strike, which actually isn't surprising, probably would be the case. And Ford were very, very concerned about this. They expressed their concerns to the government, which then prompted the intervention of the Secretary of State for Employment, a woman called Barbara Castle. She was the Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity in Harold Wilson's government. Some of us will remember her, I think. And she is always credited with, actually helping this along and all the rest of it and ending the strike and so on. And it really is a myth. She did broker a deal, which kind of ended the strike 3 weeks after it began, and the strikers were called into her office and all the rest of it. But it didn't actually solve the issue because the deal was not a very good deal at all. It increased their pay rate, but it was still 7% below that of the men, and it was 15%, which was, the women's rate was 15% lower than the men before the strike, and it was 7% lower after the strike. So, it really wasn't what they wanted at all. So they didn't win their original demand. They couldn't be moved to what was called Category C, the more skilled production jobs, but they got some form of pay rise, and they weren't particularly happy with this. A court of inquiry was then established. There was a thing called industrial courts at that time, set up in 1919, and this one was chaired by a man called Jack Scamp, who to consider the machinists regrading, but this didn't find in women's favour, and so they went and so they didn't win. They won something, but they didn't win the issue. Another one of the Dagenham women's shop stewards for the machinists, a woman called Rose Boland, said, although we did get more money, we did not gain the point. We won a battle but lost the war. I think that absolutely sums it up. So, nevertheless, not the battle was won, but it did have an impact, because despite the outcome, the Ford strike did gain quite a lot of publicity, and actually, in a way, it was quite groundbreaking and inspirational. I remember it very well indeed, I must say, and it was. Its most important significance was that it marked the beginning of a campaign for equal pay in what I said before was the hitherto neglected private sector. And that meant that actually it led to a number of other strikes, which were kind of equal pay strikes, straight pay strikes, and the formation by women trade unionists of a very important body, which people have forgotten about completely, mainly because it's got a very long title. This was called the National Joint Action Committee for Women's Equal Rights, and the JUCWA as an acronym, but nobody remembers the full title. And so there was a lot of real grassroots activity, the equal pay for women. So in other words, a women's movement began to develop. There was already a women's liberation movement, and some elements of it backed this, but this was a movement of working class women around their own demands. So there was a huge groundswell of protest. I mean, there really was a big movement, largely forgotten, actually. I'm surprised nobody's written the history of this particular anyway, they haven't. But so a big groundswell of protests against the government and against trade union inaction. And that resulted, I mean, this was beginning to be a sort of quite a militant period within the trade union movement, and in particular, an unofficial or a rank and file movement developed, largely as a result of the role of the Communist Party. It wasn't a Communist Party organisation, but the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions was extremely important in this period. And this was a militant period, really up until 1979, when Thatcher tried to smash it all. This was a real militant period of trade union not seeking to supplement or set up alternative organisations to the TUC or to union leaderships, but to chivvy them into more action. And you got a number of left-wing general secretaries being elected, particularly in the two main unions, the engineering union, Hugh Scanlon, and the Transport and General Workers Union, Jack Jones. And they did support the fight for equal pay. But again, this was a big movement from below as well. And so in 1968, the General Council, there was a majority in the General Council in favour of doing something on equal pay. They overturned the TUC advice on how to conduct this campaign, and a motion was passed in 1968 at the TUC, which called for all trade unions, trade union affiliates, to support any union taking action to support equal pay. And actually, even the TUC held a one-day conference on equal pay in November 1968. So by the end of the 1960s, I think it's on the beginnings of the 70s, most unions had declared forcefully in favour of equal pay and appeared to be, at any rate, keen to do something about it for their women members. And so in 1969, there was a really massive demonstration organised by this organisation with a very long name, the NAJAC, the National Joint Action Campaign Committee for Women's Equal Rights. It's a mouthful. And this worried the government. It worried the Wilson government tremendously. And so Barbara Castle, in order to forestall further unrest, decided to do something about it. And as a result, the 1970 Equal Pay Act was passed. And now I think you absolutely have to see this as a kind of fairly unwilling concession to forestall really further action, because this was not a brilliant piece of legislation. Basically, the Equal Pay Act permitted equal pay claims to be made from women in the public and private sectors if they were doing the same or broadly similar work. And think about that. They weren't. Hardly any women did the same or broadly similar work to a man, which is what the Ford women showed in their strike in 1968. They said their work was of equal value to that of the men. That's that quote, that big quote I gave you from Maureen, what's her name, before. So that was a bit of a dead letter, but it was even worse than that, because although the Act was passed in May 1970, it was not implemented until January 1976. So that allowed employers over 5 years in order to make, and this is the quote, reasonable adjustments. And what did that mean? Reasonable adjustments simply meant that the employers then changed job titles. So men are chefs, women are cooks, as an example. You can think of all sorts of other, I could give you a whole list of them, but it would take too long. But so you change job titles, you change job descriptions, and that's what they did. Really, in those 5 years, so it looked as though there were not same or broadly similar jobs. You can write a job description and a job spec, which is, really sort of has got so many fancy words in it to make it look as though it's the most skilled thing out. But so basically, all jobs were regraded during that period in discriminatory ways, which made really most employers absolutely immune from the very limited scope of the Act. So really, although we kind of say, oh, this was a real turning point in 1970, the Equal Pay Act, is regarded as one of the big important pieces of legislation that was passed by the Labour government. I think it was a dead letter, actually, to be honest. But nevertheless, we don't reject anything that's even halfway progressive. And I would say this was an eighth of the way progressive, not half. But so really, the long fight for equal pay was certainly not over with the passage of this first equal pay legislation. And what this act highlighted is that which had been apparent throughout the history of women's paid employment in the 19th and 20th centuries, namely that the real cause of women's low and unequal pay is the issue of job segregation and the consequent undervaluing of women's skills. Now that changed slightly because in 1983, that act was amended to include the demand for equal pay for work of equal value, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But this led to this was something, as I said, that the Ford women had already come across, and most women in the private sector recognised that that principle was extremely important. However, the real significance of what happened then in 1984 was there was another strike at Ford's, and this was the very important one because they had already noticed that the Equal Value Amendment had passed, and that was enshrined a principle. What they also knew was that they would not get anything just by relying on the law alone. In other words, there had to be collective struggle, capital versus labour, if you like, which is what the principle of trade unions is all about in a way. So basically, and this was it, by the way, 1984, we're in the height of the Thatcher period after she's declared war on trade unions. And if you think about that Thatcher period, apart from all the anti-union legislation, she never made the same mistake, by the way, the Heath government did by bringing in a single Industrial Relations Act. 12 pieces of legislation were passed during her appalling prime ministership. And again, I don't want to digress too much, but our movement suffered major defeats during that period. She took on and challenged really the best organised. So the miners were defeated, unfortunately, after a year's strike. The dockers, when they had the dock labour scheme removed, abolished, and privatisation completely, and of course the printers. I mean, that's just. So the fact that there was a strike by women workers that actually won in 1984 was quite incredible because there was a very well organised anti-strike movement that she was part of, and that was part, by the way, of the plan that she had hatched whilst the Labour government was in, whilst the trade unions, whilst the Tories were in opposition. Secret documents called stepping stones actually was a bit like the Mein Kampf of the Tory party. It indicated exactly what they intended to do, to smash the movement, to eradicate any form of socialist thought by. Anyway, I better not go into that. So back to Forwards again. So it's really, therefore, an exception to the subsequent series of trade union defeats in the Thatcher years was the successful strike this time of the women machinists at Ford. It's also quite surprising that the Equal Value Amendment was passed in 1983. Again, the only progressive piece of legislation that was passed during that period that was in any way helpful to our movement. So what happened as a result of this? We saw that why the 68 strike was unsuccessful, because basically the Equal Pay Act wouldn't have helped them at all because they weren't doing the same or broadly similar work. So the equal value argument, as I said before, was precisely the one that they'd always used all those years ago, but they didn't rely on the law or an industrial tribunal to win the battle. And just to say this about that equal value amendment, what it meant was that women could claim equal pay for work of equal value if they could prove by the job evaluation scheme that their work was equal in value in terms of effort, skill, and decision making. And then it was up to the courts to decide whether or not that was the case. Very few the law is deliberately designed to be as complicated and as difficult as possible. It didn't help us. The principle was right, but my argument is always that you can only win through collective bargaining. You can only win through struggle. You go if you rely on the law, you get nothing. And actually, you can see that with some of the battles on using this law. There was one successful case, and that was the Julie Hayward case at Camel Laird. That was the only one that actually won. But after that, there was hardly any that went through and won through the legal process. And the Ford women knew that, and as a result, they didn't rely on the law or an industrial tribunal to win their battle. They were supported at this time by their union. They were all in the Transport and General Workers Union. They took industrial action and they won. They went on strike in 1984. And the strike lasted 6 weeks, and it really was marked by incredible determination to win. I mean, it was this is I think a really, really important strike. It shows such a lot of yeah, it's a very, very important strike. The only other one I can think of, one was the Trico strike. This was earlier, that was in 1976. And that strike was an equal pay strike, and it was fully supported. The women were members of the Amalgamated Engineering Union, which, as I said, had a very progressive leadership in Hugh Scanlon. Trico, their district official was a man called Roger Butler, who's a member of the Communist Party, and he supported those women throughout, and they won through strike action. They won an equal pay dispute. And the Ford women were the next that won it through, they won equal pay through taking strike action, and it became a collective bargaining issue. So their perseverance paid off. The Ford agreed to regrade their positions to the skill category, see the skilled category, granting them pay equal to that of men in similar roles. Not the same, but their work was regarded exactly what they said in 68. What we do, the men couldn't do the machinist job, they could do all the men's job. So their work was equal in value. And that, again, taking the strike action proved to be a very wise decision because despite the Julie Hayward case, as I say, reliance on the legal process proved to be, well, lengthy or in most cases futile. So to sum up, I think I've spoken too long. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Have I? Have I gone over the time? No. You should have shut me up. So the fight for equal pay is far from over, and I think that what this shows that reliance on the law alone, inadequate as it was, really doesn't achieve results. Many women trade unions were to show that equal pay could only be fought for and sometimes won through the mechanism of collective bargaining and strong trade union organisation, but it had to be through unions that really had managed to sort of force their way out of the ideological straitjacket that capitalism forces upon people, which, you know, how does the capitalist class, the minority class, how do they succeed in in well, reproducing the relations of production and subservience is through division. So it's only through dividing people on their most observable characteristics, their biological sex and the colour of their skin. And obviously, I can't say anything about racism now, and I won't. But basically, the Ford strikes and the Trico strikers that I mentioned are two successful examples of potential power of trade unions when they at last begin to recognise the importance of fighting for all their members, women and men. So I've stopped there.
Thank you, Mary. That was excellent. I tell you, that's given a lot of things to think about. And I'm going through the questions that have been asked, they're diverse and all over the place, but it'll give you a great opportunity to expand on some of the points you've made. If I may be cheeky and just make a point from my own experience, I used to work in local government, and they had a job evaluation scheme for manual workers up until the mid-1990s, which supposedly gave equal pay for work of equal value. But every job that was deemed to be a man's job then attracted a bonus scheme. And none of the so-called women's jobs did. So with connivance between the trade unions and the employers, they had an equal pay scheme, but then destroyed it to keep the differential going. Right, the first question then, I said the quite diverse, Mary, is from Louisa, who's wondering if in fact the patriarchal attitude stems from religion. And why
what,
does Hinduism manage to treat women the same as men, or appear to do?
what do you want me to do
Well, I don't know, which would you prefer? That's quite
no,
different from others. So do you want to deal with that one first?
well, patriarchal attitudes are obviously are bolstered by religion, all religions, I have to say, but that they serve the interests of those who seek to divide us. And women have been oppressed in all forms of class society, and I'd like to be able to say much more about that, but that's another talk, isn't it, altogether? But it serves the interests of those who want to rule and dominate us to maintain those divisions. And the role of the family. Engels wrote a lot about this on looking at the in his very famous book, the origins of the family, private property, and the state. When he argued that men managed to obtain the surplus, and therefore women were subservient. Women's role in rearing and caring for children rendered them made their lives very difficult in order to actually, as I said before, the whole thing for women is this thing of work and home, and to have this notion of women's place is in the home, but yet women have always worked. So how does society resolve those contradictions? They don't. Women have to, by taking part-time jobs. Anyway, this is a big thing, but I don't think it's only religion. I think it's the whole ideology of division which serves those who want to make profit out of this, and more profit is made out of women.
That's very. I think the next question, I'm just going to see how disciplined you are in keeping to the subject of the question.
Oh,
The Equal Pay Act came on the statute book in 1970. Do you think the new Labour government will actually implement equal pay in reality?
no, no, that's the law is there. But no, it's trade unions that have got to get their act together, and they've got to make it a bargaining priority. It's got to be, but then that means that we've got to reassert all the collective bargaining. How many workers now are covered by collective agreements? That's something we've got to remedy. That's what Thatcher spent so much time trying to destroy. So I don't think we can ever we, we've only ever won anything through struggle, ever, including the right to vote, including everything else. So the law is there.
Right. I, were there any leading female trade unionists around at the time? A
When?
question.
Well, well, what time? You mean 60?
Well, at the time of the Dagenham dispute,
Well, that's a
or was it 100% men leading the
no,
trade
women
unions?
were in trade unions, but actually, this was a huge issue because it's only with the growth of the women's movement that you began to get a challenge to the fact that almost all, um, I can't think of a single union in the 1960s that had a woman general secretary, for example. I mean, even in the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, for example, which was
Mm.
99% women, there wasn't a woman. I think there was once a woman president, but no, I mean, and so this is a real issue, really, that why we have to really fight for women's self-organisation because and that's what happened as a result of this movement for equal pay, plus the women's movement in general. We began to get the demand for women's courses, women's conferences, women in leadership positions, and all of that. That really started in the 70s.
Right. A question next from Grace. Do you think there's something particular about textile-related work that makes mobilisation more likely and change the way it develops?
Oh, yeah, because it's a quiet. Ah, yes, that's a good point, actually. Because it's quiet and people can talk whilst they're doing it. I think that's probably what Grace means, does she? Because one early example of trade union organisation, it's actually men, but went back a long way, with shoemakers who were very radical because this is before machine-based industry. I think actually, to be honest, industrial sewing machines are quite noisy, so
Mm.
I think. But so I'm sort of thinking around that really. Yes and no. If that's what I don't know if that's what grace means, but
I'm sure Grace will come back if that's not what she means. But an interesting one now then, you made reference to chefs and cooks, which is an argument I always use, but that's been questioned here. A chef is a chief,
a
a
chef is
chef de cuisine and head of the kitchen, whereas a cook is, yeah.
yeah, well, it's just one that was used by employers after the 1970 Act when they had these period of adjustment. So, um, and of course, a chef de cuisine, yes, we've got to pay him more money.
It's interesting. What would you call the manager of a canteen in a school?
Well, there you go. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Uh,
exactly the point. Yeah. See, when I talk about job segregation, really we're talking about the four C's: catering, cleaning, cooking, clerical. Actually, I've missed one. Well, anyway, let's say them. And they're all, as it were, offshoots of women's domestic production. Women don't, generally speaking, didn't do apprenticeships because women were excluded from certain trades. For example, well, I mean, they were excluded from almost every trade, really. But the one trade that they had well, yes, bookbinding was a well play, but they were excluded from that in the end. So why don't you find women engineers? Well, I'm talking about in the 19th century. You had to, these were well paid jobs. You had to do an apprenticeship. Women were exclusively barred from those things. I mean, so that job segregation, and because these jobs were seen as women's jobs then automatically, it's what's making a point about skill. Why don't we think that clerical work is skilled. It's because women do it, and yet you can. I guess there's so many examples of this. I think you can think of them yourself, but it's just yeah, training, apprenticeships, education, all of these things that are to do with women's skills. And also the other thing is that there was there's there was a big movement, especially after the First World War, and to some extent after the Second World War, to against married women being allowed to work. In fact, a lot of unions, like the Post Office Workers Union, after the First World War, explicitly argued that married women, should not be allowed to work on the grounds that their husbands earned enough to look after them and their children. So this myth of the family wage really went on and on and on, and it's still part of the social security system because women pay in their contributions are less because somehow or other the men it's based on the male breadwinner always, and what a lot of women don't have male breadwinners in their lives. You know, there's just don't. They're single parents or they're whatever. So the system is sort of like kind of rigged against women and women workers, right from the word go. And the reasons are obvious, I think. We're cheap.
It's interesting you made the point about the post office, because there's a question stroke comment here from Alan, who says the 1975 Equalities Act led to the end of men-only jobs in the post office.
Yes, it did. Yeah. But it's taken a long time, hasn't
it? Yeah.
To be
A
honest.
question here from Tim, wanting to know what effect did the Dagenham dispute have on the density and membership makeup within Fords at Dagenham after the dispute?
Oh, yeah, very, very high rates of. I haven't got the figures to be honest, but I know that. Well, for one thing, the density was very
Was it a
high
closed
anyway.
shop at the time?
Sorry, no,
Was
it
it a
wasn't a
closed
closed shop.
shop?
No,
No.
no, but very, very high density.
Right.
Anyway, I think almost all the women were members. Well, particularly when the National Union of Vehicle Builders or whatever merged with the TNG, and the TNG had a progressive leadership. So yeah, high rates of women membership. Yeah, and again, actually, women are now over 50% in terms of membership of the entire trade union movement. You wouldn't think so, but.
Yeah. Question from Maggie. Are PFIs beginning in the 1990s part of the destruction of trade unions?
Oh God, yeah. Yes.
Yes.
What more can I say? You obviously know the answer to that one.
Yeah.
But what
In what
what
way?
really, well, no, because what the real issue is a creeping privatization. That's the thing. The public sector is just disappearing before our eyes, isn't it? I mean, into schools, what are academy schools? They're taking them out of the public sector. These become, PFI is handing over. I presume you're thinking of the health service particularly. I don't know, but it's being handed over to private capital. So, you know, we're going to have. Well, what can I say? We're seeing it happening increasingly, and also with the new this government's NHS reforms. Again, it's handing over to American multinational companies, including doctor surgeries. So we've got the illusion that somehow or other we own it, but we don't own anything.
There's you mentioned you weren't going to get embroiled in the issue of race earlier on. There's a direct question here. It's quite interesting. that there is inequality of treatment between women and men, is that exaggerated in the case of black women?
Yes. Yes, I think what we have to see is the chief means of maintaining what Marxists call the relations of production, i.e., our so-called consent to be exploited. You know, when you consider that really we make up 80% and the employers make up, well, you know, capitalists make up such a small proportion. It was called 784, wasn't it? There was a theatre group called that
Yes, yes.
7% of um, yeah, 7% of the population, or 84% of the world. So how do you maintain that system? Well, I think the real way of doing that is on the basis of division, and the division has always been throughout history on the most recognizable characteristics and features of workers, the color of their skin and their sex. And how else can we explain the fact that women um, well, no, but gone on to race. So if you look at the history of British imperialism, which I can't really look now, what racism existed before the British Empire existed. Of course, it did because of slavery. But Britain's industrial wealth, or Britain's Industrial Revolution, really was based on the labour of slaves. Why? Because the first branch of industry to be mechanised was cotton. Cotton isn't grown in this country. Cotton is grown really through slave labour. So that's one thing. So slavery is integral to Britain's industrial supremacy. And then the steady expansion of the British Empire, which basically meant Britain taking over and conquering and decimating indigenous populations in Africa, Asia, the West Indies, wherever. Really, that went hand in hand with popularizing and ensuring that racist ideology became an ideology that penetrated the minds of everybody. Why? Because how can you justify the notion that somehow or other Britain has the right to rule over conquered peoples, all of whom have a different colour skin? You have to have a sophisticated ideology that somehow or other the white race is superior. And that notion of racial superiority by the 1880s, 1890s, when education was free and compulsory, was then a dominant ideology which penetrated every single school history and geography textbook, and I've read hundreds of them, which just had this implicit assumption about the Kipling thing, the white man's burden. So racism went hand in hand with this, and that this meant that the role of the British Empire also meant that capital invests its money where the rate of return is the highest. And the rate of return is, we know that profit is made out of the exploitation of human labour power. So the rate of return on capital investment is basically to ensure that it's invested where the rate of exploitation can be the highest, and that is, of course, in the colonies that Britain controls. But even today, in the neo-colonial, what we call the neo-colonial world, it's still happening. So women and black people are a source of massive super profit, but racist ideology and sexist ideology penetrated our movement as well as obviously the employers love it, but it also penetrated our movement and created those divisions, which is why you know, there's the other dimension of unequal pay clearly relates to black workers, men and women. So I would say that black women, whereas white women are uh, we'd say super exploited or double exploited. All workers are exploited. Women workers are double exploited, and I would say that black women are triply exploited.
Thanks very much for that comprehensive answer. The a question here from Tim. Mary, you made reference to a push for work of comparable nature definition being advanced in the 1930s by more militant trade unions. Could you say a little bit more on that and the sectors involved and what
Sorry,
success?
work of what? Not. I don't think I did.
The
say.
question is, you made reference to a push for work of comparable nature definition in the 1930s.
In the 19th, I don't
Can
think.
you expand on it a little bit?
I can't remember saying that, to be honest. I did say.
On what sectors were being advanced and how was it curtailed or squashed?
Well, I don't think there was any push for equal pay in the 1930s. In the 1950s, I said that.
It might be a typo.
No, okay. 1950s in the civil service, there was a bit of a push. Oh, and amongst teachers as well. But now that's a good example, by the way. Sorry, I'm slight digression, but here, what it just shows you how stupid. Well, how the ideology is exactly that. It's ideology. Why didn't men and women, male and female teachers, get equal pay? They didn't until 1967. That wasn't even a question. Why don't civil servants get equal pay? Because generally speaking, they were doing, clerical work, men and women. So that was pushed, that demand in the 1950s amongst civil servants. Then they had to invent this thing that somehow or other the women weren't doing comparable work. And you had this grading structure within the civil service, executive office, chief executive office, blah, blah, blah. And so you kind of mask the equality that the work was by putting sort of, spurious bits of job descriptions and job titles into. So the comparable nature thing was a sort of try to get round the artificial hierarchy that existed, where men were at the top or top grades, but because they had a bit more managerial responsibility, i.e., they could boss a woman around. Usually, that's what that managerial responsibility means. And teachers, it's all sort of ludicrous. I mean, I can't explain what is nonsense. Do you know what I mean? It's not because it is nonsense, but it's all fictitious nonsense, and it's only how when Marx said philosophers have tried to understand the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Well, understanding something which is ideologically driven and is so partial and partisan, so comparable nature, that they used that term, but they didn't get very far, to be honest. They didn't get very far.
That's no more questions. Actually, I wonder if I could ask one and if you like expand on this need for organisation and militancy within the trade union movement, because there is so much of people having a faith in the establishment, whether it be the government or legislation, to deliver what they want, and we know in practice it doesn't happen. Another example, like pension age. We went for equality and we ended up with women's pension age going up.
Yeah.
But again, during the 1960s and 70s, there were a lot of big industrial plants with many people working under the same roof. Whereas today, a lot of those big industries have gone and people are working in much more diverse and disparate workplaces. How do we actually organise them? Not just that, raise a consciousness about solidarity.
You're asking me to answer that question. This is the big question, isn't it? I mean, on this fragmented workplace, it's going to get worse. AI is coming. It's going to be much more. All this working at home stuff, all the rest of it. I mean, the big question for everybody who's a socialist is how do you raise socialist consciousness? How do you get people to understand that actually, and to see through all the false consciousness, the ideological barriers that the ideological apparatus of the state forces upon us. And by the ideological apparatus of the state, I mean the education system, who controls the media, everything that gets into our brains, our heads, which is none of which is controlled by us. The only thing that we control is one little paper called the Morning Star. So, you're asking. This is something that we ought to discuss much more and much more widely. How do we raise the level of consciousness so that people can see through this? Not that we're the clever ones and we need to teach, but people just to understand just on this little basis, just the notion that somehow or other women are unequal precisely, or deserve to be treated unequally, which is still going on. I mean, we still have not got equal pay. So I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but I just think that the question you asked is the question that underlines everything. And I mean, if you'd like me to spend another 2 hours telling you, but I want to tell you, I think we should have the discussion about this. That's our role, and then we could get a fighting trade union movement, a fighting movement that would just, expose all this nonsense, get rid of a lot of them, and would have a socialist society.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll finish on that. I think that's a lovely way to end it. That's been brilliant, and I think the lesson that's coming is you can't rely on anybody else but yourself, your work colleagues, your organisation, your consciousness,
Yeah.
and fight for it, however hard that is. And I think what the GFTU are doing in courses like this are
And Marx Memorial Library and
helping,
Workers' School, by the
and
way.
the Marx Memorial Library, the
That's
Workers'
what we do all the
Library,
time.
and I think regrettably not the leaders of the trade union movement. But I think with the work that's being done is starting to develop that sort of discussion that hopefully will open minds.
Yeah. And that's
Thanks very much, Mary. That was brilliant.
Sorry.
I want to just now promote the next session, which interestingly, you made reference to the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions. The next session is Roger Seaford talking precisely about that.
Yeah.
And that is on the 1st of April, 7 p.m. And I hope everybody here can attend that and let everybody that wasn't here know about it and ask them to come along. So I'll close that now. Thanks very much indeed for coming.
Thank you. I haven't seen the chat or anything, so is there any way that I can, has everybody gone, by the way? Can't hear you, Ben. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, we just end.
Yeah. Any way of seeing the, is there anything worth that I should see in the chat?
No, not really.
Don't worry about it. We're just everyone's saying thank you and see you next time. And it was a great talk. See you next session, splendid session. Thanks, Mary. And a wonderful talk. Many thanks. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's all
how many were here then?
Yeah. What's that?
How many were present?
There were about 40 at one point. It's everyone's leaving now. So
yeah.
All right. I'll end it now. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.